Hi, this is Paul, and this is Rough Draft for Sunday, where I run through the current edition of my Sunday sermon. Now, this week's a little different because I'm recording this on Thursday. Tomorrow is Christmas Eve, and at Livingstone's we will have a lessons of carols, carols and lessons, basically text and no real sermon. We're having a joint service with our daughter/sister congregation, City Life, and that's 4 o'clock on Friday. That'll probably be after this. If you're curious about that, you can probably find it on the church YouTube page. But so this sermon actually comes after Christmas, and well, you'll see why. So if you have comments about the sermon, part of the reason I put these rough drafts out are I like your comments, and I take criticism, pointers, all of those things pretty seriously, because part of the difficulty of being a preacher is you're sort of a captive to yourself. And so, yeah. Fan fiction. So those of you who are listening don't get to see the interesting picture of Captain America making out with Wonder Woman, of Harry Potter carrying a lightsaber, Harry Potter and Hermione, of pregnant young Captain Kirk with Spock lovingly caressing from behind, and halfway cut off some dude in the Princess Leia, Jabba the Hutt bikini. Fan fiction. You've got the TARDIS and Mordor back there. Fan fiction. A lot of people in my church won't know what fan fiction is, so I'll explain it a little bit. As governing stories of our civilization recedes and our capacity to visually imagine stories proliferates, the stories we tell increasingly take on religious significance. In many ways, fandoms, for some, have functionally replaced some Christian traditions and denominations. The professional story makers can't keep up with the demand because our religious appetites are voracious. And so people want to not just receive revelation from their favorite authors, but in fact to participate in the creation of religion. And this makes what we call fan fiction. Fan fiction is always in a degree of competition with canon. If George Lucas writes something, it's canon. But then when George Lucas writes things that fans don't want, they question whether he has kept to canon. And some of the Star Wars prequels were full of those kinds of conversations. Stories, mashups, memes created by fans who want to not just receive inspiration from these stories, but to participate in their creation. Recently, one of my favorite podcasts, The Rest is History, did an episode on superheroes. Tom Holland was remarkably ill-equipped to engage in this conversation. He knew almost nothing about them, but I thought the conversation was quite good and quite productive. And one of the things that I came about is, again, some fine-tuning of my thoughts, which I've shared before, on the relationship between religions and superheroes. You see, we don't really relate or participate with the gods in exactly the same way that we wish to participate in stories of superheroes or the heroes of the major franchises like Star Wars, Luke Skywalker, Harry Potter, that dominate the lives, especially of so many young people. Many of the people in my church are in some ways too old, and they were around before the creation of these new gods and these new religions. But in Mary Beard's description of Romulus and Zeus, I think we can have something of a sense of how ancient religions are different from modern superhero ones. According to one Roman tradition, the temple of Jupiter, where Cicero harangued Catiline on 8 November 63 BC, has been established several centuries earlier by Romulus, Rome's founding father. Romulus and the new citizens of his tiny community were fighting their neighbors, a people known as the Sabines, on the site that later became the Forum, the political center of Cicero's Rome. Things were going badly for the Romans, and they had been driven to retreat. As a last attempt to snatch victory, Romulus prayed to the god Jupiter. Not just to Jupiter, in fact, but to Jupiter Stator, Jupiter who holds men firm. He would build a temple in thanks. Romulus promised the god if only the Romans would resist the temptation to run for it and stand their ground against the enemy. They did, and the temple of Jupiter Stator was erected on that very spot, the first in a long series of shrines and temples the city built to commemorate divine help in securing military victory for Rome. It's interesting the psychological nuances between watching Harry Potter and dressing up to sort of embody Harry Potter. I think there's some of this in people, but quite clearly the buffered self of modernity doesn't lend itself to inviting Jupiter Stator to somehow possess the troops so that they can stand, and then celebrating and rewarding Jupiter with the creation of a temple. Perhaps the closest thing we can get to is by Grabthar's hammer in the sort of mocking Galaxy Quest, another favorite of mine, where they're sort of poking fun at Star Trek and Star Trek fans who LARP, but in this case, the old, nearly out to pasture, worn out crew that is so sick of these lines is beamed up by real aliens to help them fight their own war after they've been inspired by watching the so-called historical footage. And now all these actors wearing their makeup have to somehow not tell the aliens that they're fakes. And then, of course, one of the turning points of the movie is when the actor who has been sick to death of his role finds someone who actually believes in him shot, mimics the holy words, rallies the troops, and defeats the aliens, even though he knows it's a made-up story made up by a bunch of second-rate Hollywood writers. This, for many today, sort of establishes the limits of what they imagine themselves permitted to believe. We reveal ourselves by our stories. Joseph Campbell, of course, talked about the monomyth and the hero's journey. And Christianity has deeply infused our imagination along these stories. All over the place you find resurrections in movies, and even if Christ isn't named, there's always a Christ figure one way or another. But the stories we tell are blends both of Christianity, of Christian stories, and the assumptions, aspirations of what we feel to be most important now. Now, over the last couple of centuries, historians and archaeologists have discovered a lot of Fringy Jesus fan fiction. And if you want to read about them, a lot of this has to do with sort of the childhood of Jesus. And you can find a website by the University of Dayton, Ohio, which has really quite a nice list of them. To read them is quite interesting. Often you'll find Jesus as a child being annoyed by his playmates who are mean to them, and he kills them. Now, of course, he doesn't sort of like Cain and Abel have to pick up a stone or a knife or do something like that. He just kills them. And then the parents are upset by this and run to Mary and Joseph and say, hey, your boy just killed my boy. Have him stop. And then in this case, Joseph goes to Mary and says, Mary, do something about the boy. And Mary chastises Jesus and, raises him from the dead, and on to the next story. Now, what's remarkable about this is that I don't think anyone today would create boyhood stories of Jesus that look like this, because our public relations Jesus that we have today is way too zen and nice and kind than to kill any of his playmates. Basically, the idea in the ancient world was, well, if a little boy had power, what would he do with it? And then they sort of imagine what he would do with it. And they tell the stories, and well, Mary isn't going to let her little boy be the genocidal maniac of the neighborhood. That's really quite unbecoming of little boy Jesus. So she chastises him, and he eventually does the right thing and makes some birds out of clay, and they all fly away. The stories reveal the assumptions of the story writers about how the world works and how Jesus would act in such a world. Now, a good many people I talk to these days like to say things like, well, I like the Bible, but it's just all full of legends and things. Oh, okay. But if the New Testament is all legends, why don't we have more stories of little boy Jesus doing the kinds of things that we find in these stories? And this, what basically I think is sort of analogous to fan fiction that comes a few centuries later. We have, in fact, I think part of the reason there's so much fan fiction about that is that there's remarkably little about Jesus in the canonical Bible. In Matthew, you have the Magi coming and Mary and Joseph fleeing to Egypt. In Luke, you have Jesus' dedication at the temple and Jesus then dawdling in the temple later on when he's 12. And now pay attention that both stories are associated with the temple. It's the second of which that we'll read today. After the dedication of the temple, when Joseph and Mary had done everything required by the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee to their own town of Nazareth. And the boy grew and became strong. He was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was on him. Now, for a lot of secular people, when they read that second verse, it's decidedly unsecular, and so they think, well, this is really saying something. And it is saying something, but anyone who's read a lot of the Old Testament knows this is sort of a standard way to talk about such things. Of Ishmael, Abraham's first son, God was with the boy and he grew up. Of Samson, someone who's pretty famous but not necessarily for always doing the right thing, the boy grew up and the Lord blessed him. Samuel is really the pattern that gets followed quite closely here. The boy Samuel continued to grow in stature and in the favor of the Lord and with the people. And I don't know if little boy Jesus killing his neighbors would really be going, his neighbors' playmates would be going in the favor of the people. And Samuel, of course, is a special case because he's dedicated to the Lord's service by his mother, who brings him to the tabernacle. And then the phrase, the boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. Jesus, interestingly enough here, is both fringe, Nazareth, and center, temple. Jesus sort of occupies both the boundaries and the center in the story. And what you find throughout these passages is Jesus is both ordinary and exemplary. And you see this with Mary and Joseph as well. Every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. That shows that they were very observant, very dedicated, religious people who were following the prescriptions of their religion at the time. When he was 12 years old, they went up to the festival according to custom. Jesus' parents were faithful Jews. Mary is exemplary. They were exemplary, but also normal, which is quite unlike pregnant Captain Kirk. After the festival was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it. Thinking that he was in their company, they traveled on for a day. Then they began looking for him among the relatives and friends, and when they did not find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. Again, this is a very ordinary story. This isn't Jesus making little doves fly and doing little tricks and killing his little playmates who annoy him. The story emphasizes Jesus' connection to the temple, and I think that is not incidental to any of the stories because in many ways Jesus, for the Christians, replaces the temple in terms of function. So Jesus' story emphasizes Jesus' connection to the temple, but very much situated in the world as commonly perceived among the people. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. Now, of course, 3 days, 3 days in the tomb, 3 days in the temple, 3 is a very important number. What he's doing there is fairly normal, but again, also exemplary. We have a precocious young man who is at the frontier between childhood and manhood. This is actually kind of an important thing. There were these certain boundary markers and rites of passage. The first one we have with the dedication at the temple. The second one, age from 12 to 30, someone is an adult but not a leader. And at 30, then when Jesus begins his public ministry, is in fact the same age that Jesus, that someone who would be an adult, would enter temple service. So right away, you see very much how Jesus is tied into both the ordinary in a very exemplary sort of way. Now, this tie at 12 years old at the time of the writing of the text is also very interesting, because if you look at Josephus, who was a contemporary writer roughly in this period, when he retells the story of Samuel, you have, when Samuel was 12 years old, he began to prophesy. And once when he was asleep, God called to him by his name, and he, supposing he had been called by the high priest, came to him. But when the high priest said he did not call him, God did so thrice. Now this basically is Josephus rendering the story from the book of Samuel. But notice, the book of Samuel doesn't give the age, but the tradition at the time, quite clearly as manifest by Josephus, is that Samuel was 12. Samuel, 12, prophesying in the temple. Jesus, 12, talking to the religious leaders who are astounded at his wisdom. And again, we're looking at this. Luke is carefully locating Jesus within the long set story of his people. Observant, normal, exemplary. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. Now, this is going to become a pattern in the Gospel of Luke. His mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." Now, notice Mary and Joseph aren't somehow these Zenish people who are sort of above it all. They are having exactly the kind of response to Jesus that any loving, normal, ordinary, exemplary parent would have with respect to Jesus. Jesus' response, however, is strange. Now, he's not killing his playmates, and he's not making little birds out of clay birds, but his answer is also remarkable, but yet not unbelievable. Why were you searching for me? Well, we just told you why we were searching for you, because we're your parents and we were worried, and you are 12. Well, there's a transition that's going on between parent and child at this point, quite obviously. He asked, "Didn't you know that I would be in my Father's house?" Now, of course, this is tied in with Luke and all of the stuff that has come before that we've talked a bit about in Advent, and you can read it in Luke chapter 1 and Luke chapter 2. And then the next phrase is probably the most remarkable. But they did not understand what he was saying to them. And in fact, it's difficult to understand, yet maybe they should have, given again everything in chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Luke, but there's going to be more of the story, and right away we're sort of set up to understand the uncomfortable way that Jesus is going to be. A way that in many ways, in some ways, encourages fan fiction, yet also discourages it, because none of our fiction can really capture him. This is a very different picture from those other fan fiction stories. There's a sense of believability to it. It fits into a historical context, and there are intimations of what is to come, but they are subtle and confusing, which are probably two of the best descriptions of how we see Jesus. He's subtle, and he's confusing. And then the text ends pretty much exactly where it begins. When they went down to Nazareth with them, okay, he was just at the center, now back to the fringe, and was obedient to them. Normal, exemplary. But his mother treasured all these things in her heart. She didn't understand them. She sort of kept them there, waiting for further information in order to make meaning of them and map them into her world. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. Almost a direct quote from Samuel about Samuel. I think you can see the differences between the fan fiction and the canonical takes. One is sort of fantastical. Well, I imagine little boy Jesus, and I imagine little boy Jesus would do this. The other one seems very much rooted in a time and a place, and is sort of like the kinds of things we bump into in our life that are, Well, they're a little stranger than we might imagine because truth is stranger than fiction, even fan fiction, but it's strange in a particularly peculiar way. See, the problem with Galaxy Quest is you need more than just a story. Many people who are sort of enthusiastic because of a story go on to realize that their enthusiasm is writing checks that the rest of their life can't cash. Inspiration is lovely, but if it doesn't scale above the glandular, it isn't going to cut it. What comes to my mind is a letter by C.S. Lewis to one of his childhood friends, one of his closest friends. He calls him his first friend, Arthur Greaves. And Lewis is writing to Arthur about his decision and about his discovery that he has become a Christian. What had been holding me back at any rate for the last year or so was not so much a difficulty in believing as a difficulty in knowing what the doctrine meant. What is this business with Jesus as a boy in a temple? How does that all fit together? You can't believe a thing while you're ignorant what the thing is. My puzzle was the whole doctrine of redemption. In what sense the life and death of Jesus Christ saved or opened salvation to the world? I could see how miraculous salvation might be necessary. One could see from ordinary experience how sin, in the case of a drunkard, C.S. Lewis's brother Warney, struggled with alcoholism, could get a man to such a point as he was bound to reach hell. And if you know aspects of C.S. Lewis's life, he understood hellish examples on earth, complete degradation and misery. I can imagine many times Lewis lived with his brother Warney much of his life. Many times Lewis would try to care for his brother when there was in many ways no power that Lewis had to save his brother from the bottle. He was bound to hell, complete degradation and misery in this life unless something quite beyond merely natural help or effort steps in. But it's not necessarily something which is pregnant Captain Kirk or Harry Potter wielding a lightsaber. And I could well imagine a whole world being in the same state and similarly needing a miracle. What I couldn't see was how life and death of someone else, whoever he was 2,000 years ago, could help me here and now, except insofar as his example helped us. We sort of have Grabthar's hammer there. But the example business, though true and important, is not Christianity. Christianity isn't, us together chanting the chant written by the second-rate Hollywood writers. The example business, though true and important, is not Christianity. Right in the center of Christianity, in the Gospels and St. Paul, you keep on getting something quite different and very mysteriously expressed in those phrases. I have so often ridiculed propitiation, sacrifice, the blood of the Lamb, expressions which I could only interpret in senses that seemed to me silly or shocking. He was quite a sharp-tongued atheist before these turns in his life. Now that Dyson and Tolkien showed me was this. What if I met the idea of sacrifice in a pagan story? I didn't mind it at all. Again, if I met the idea of a god sacrificing himself to himself, for example, the quotation opposite the page of Daimer, I liked it very much and was mysteriously moved by it. Stories have that power. And again, that the idea of a dying and reviving god, Balder, Adonis, Bacchus, similarly moved me provided I met it anywhere except in the Gospels. It's so much fun if it's in fiction that we write about the world. The reason was that in pagan stories, I was prepared to feel the myth as profound and suggestive of meaning beyond my grasp, even though I could not say in cold prose what it meant. Was there Jesus behind Harry Potter? Behind Luke Skywalker? In this monomyth? In what way? Now, the story of Christ is simply a true myth, a myth working on us in the same way as the others, but with this tremendous difference that it really happened, and has tells from the happening. And one must be content to accept it in the same way, remembering that it is God's myth where the others are men's myths. The pagan stories are God expressing himself through the minds of poets, using such images as he found there. Jesus killing his little playmates, making little birdies out of clay. While Christianity is God expressing himself through what we call real things. A real people, a real mother, worried parents, a real temple, leaders in the temple. Therefore, it is true, not in the sense of being a description of God, that no finite mind could take in, but in the sense of being the way in which God chooses or can appear to our faculties. How would God reveal himself in a little boy? Killing his playmates? We would shudder at such a thought. Ancients thought that would be very keeping. Mary and Joseph look at him and think, what is going on here? The doctrines we get out of the true myth are, of course, less true. They are translations into our concepts and ideas of what God has already expressed in a language more adequate, more concrete, namely the actual incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection. Does this amount to a belief in Christianity? At any rate, I am now certain that A, that this Christian story is to be approached in a sense as I have approached other myths, and B, that it is most important and full of meaning. I am also nearly certain that it really happened. Now, again, it's not very difficult for us to spot fan fiction, and this doesn't read like fan fiction. The little images we have of Jesus in our imaginations are filled with a hodgepodge of all these sorts of stories that if you tried to act them out in the real world would fall apart. That's again, as Lewis said, sort of the difference between the myths we tell and in some ways must tell and who Jesus really was. Jesus was more mysterious, more ordinary, more exemplary, and more probably unnerving. Now, what we do is we use canon, just like all the fan fiction writers do, to calibrate. Fan fiction is judged not just on popularity, but on canon. When fan fiction breaks canon, people get upset because you can only have a community if you actually have a canon. Luke on Jesus the boy is filled with canonical calibrations, all the way from the Old Testament. Samuel, Samson, Ishmael. Luke's paying very close attention to the source and can we error check Jesus? Can we evaluate Jesus? What measure would we use? The Christians used the Old Testament. Now, that doesn't mean there wouldn't be discussions about it, and those discussions continue to this day among Jews and Muslims, but that's the checker. Myths are stories we try to live within. Sticking to the canon will guide your daily story making. Now, really where we're going is from normal to normative. And again, quite reasonably, anxious parents find Jesus and what he says to them doesn't look like killing playmates or making birdies, but yet it's disquieting because it's real. They did not understand what he was saying to them. Didn't you know that I had to be in my Father's house? What do you mean, Jesus? What do you mean? Can you explain it to us? When the true myth moves in, we find ourselves reaching beyond ourselves. He is one of us, and yet somewhat alien. He is not the product of our whims and desires. Those usually are pretty easily told one to another. He comes to both be with us and to bring us beyond ourselves. Do you wish to believe? If you wish to believe, that's a good thing. You need to live in a myth. You want to live in a myth. Can you make your way into this one? How? Ask and it will be given. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open. But always remember that all who knock ask. And it's up to the one to open the door. So open your hands, ask to receive, and trust in his goodness.